Do you know how rarely I have a video intro? It's so exciting. So we're beginning a new sermon series about putting ourselves in another's shoes. And we've got a story about taking our shoes off. So we're 2 for 2 on shoes. We've understood the assignment. But what do Moses' bare feet have to do with us? And what does any of that have to do with our theme? Sometimes I think we get too used to familiar stories. I think a lot of us have probably heard about the burning bush. Maybe that goes back to vacation Bible school for you, or Sunday school, or maybe you saw it in films like The Prince of Egypt or The 10 Commandments. Maybe you didn't grow up in the church. But it's pretty native to our culture. We're pretty familiar with it. And so we can get so used to it that we start to gloss over the details. Maybe we get so comfortable with the story that we forget to go exploring. So we're going to take a closer look today and see if there's something new for us here. I'll set the scene. Moses has bounced around a little bit, right? You'll remember he was born to an Israelite mother who had to save him by setting him adrift on the river. And he was found and adopted by Pharaoh's daughter and given an Egyptian name. But then tough circumstance, he ends up murdering an Egyptian, and then he's rejected by the Egyptian people, kind of run him out of town, and he flees, and he ends up shepherding flocks far from the splendor of Pharaoh's household, working for his father-in-law. So Moses has never really found a home. That's going to be a theme, by the way, with Moses. In fact, in the last chapter, Moses' son has just been born, and Moses has cried out very dramatically, I must say, "I have been an alien residing in a foreign land." Even as his son is being born, he's saying, "I'm a man without a country." So here he is, down on his luck, minding his own business, tending these sheep. And lo and behold, he winds up at Mount Horeb, or also translated Sinai, the mountain of God, right? So that's going to be a theme too. Moses is always getting in trouble on mountaintops, you know what I mean? Because back in Moses' day, it was understood that mountaintops were the dwelling place for the divine. And there Moses comes across this unquenchable burning bush. Now, every time I've read this story, I've mostly found the bush very distracting, trying to get my mind around that kind of image. And then we've moved into, Moses, take off your sandals. And I've thought, well, that must have just been a way to show reverence, right? I've just taken it at face value. And it's true, this is an ancient practice of entering a holy place and taking off your shoes as a sign that you recognize the divine presence. Removing your shoes is still a practice of reverence in Islam and other religions. But since it's not native to my culture, and maybe you feel the same way, I've just kind of treated that as long time ago stuff, right? That's not really considered very appropriate these days. We don't take off our shoes in church. So I just kind of put it out of my mind as something a little irrelevant to my life. In fact, the one time I have really thought about it in depth, I remember this one time I was a counselor at a great Methodist camp back home in Tennessee. And one night we were doing worship out on the field, and they had us take off our shoes. You know the kind of thing. They said, well, this week at camp, this is going to be holy ground, for you. So take off your shoes like Moses did. And I just remember that me and these little children got so many fire ant bites trying to get close to Jesus that night. That's my whole frame of reference. I'm going to be honest on the shoes thing. So how many of you thought when you heard, oh, the campus minister's coming and she's going to talk about Moses and his shoes, and you thought, please don't let her take off her shoes to try to make a point. And please don't let her try to get me to take my shoes off, right? Because we all know why we don't do things like that it's taking off your shoes in the wrong place is kind of a vulnerable, kind of naked kind of feeling, right? So that's my whole frame of reference before I did a little digging this week. And I discovered that there might be a few more ways to look at Moses' shoes than I thought. And I'll get to how this relates to stepping into somebody else's shoes. See, it is about reverence. Lots of theologians say, yep, it's in the text, it's pretty clear. It's about reverence. But some people, some theologians, believe that removing his sandals has a second significance. See, taking off one's sandals is a gesture in traditional cultures, not only for entering a worship space, but also for entering a home. Japan is a great example of a modern day place where this is practiced completely, ubiquitously in the culture. And so a home is a place where you can take your shoes off and get comfortable, right? A place where vulnerability is welcome and expected. That's the kind of place you'd feel comfortable taking your shoes off. And so the theologians ask, what if it could be both? What if God is not only saying, Moses, this is a time to be reverent, but also maybe God is inviting Moses to find his true home here, to be comfortable and vulnerable with God. Perhaps he is inviting Moses to be himself. Take your shoes off. Take your coat off. Stay a while. Chat with me. Be real with me. And Moses is completely himself in this scene, right? Like you would think if it was all only about reverence, he would stoop and bow and say, yes, yes, Lord, absolutely, I'll do whatever you say. But Moses does not respond how we might expect. He's not posturing as the most reverent guy here. Moses takes off his shoes and then God says, hey, I've got a plan to free the Israelites from Egypt. And Moses says, I think you've got the wrong guy, right? Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? He does not fall in line. Moses is free to be himself in this story. Even in the most classic calling and commissioning story in the Bible, Moses is on holy ground, but he is 100% human. And God says, I'll meet you there and I'll walk with you the whole way. We're going to Egypt together. Moses is on holy ground, but he's 100% human. And now that I see that human side to this story too, this is the nugget of wisdom that's exciting. Are you paying attention? So now that we've got this idea that it might be about coming home, it might be about vulnerability. I'm going to get away from this mic. We're going to go on an adventure. I've realized that the nugget of wisdom in this text is that holiness looks different to everyone, and we all respond a little differently to it. We don't all respond to God's call in the same way. Who of us in Moses' position would have been like, we're going to Egypt? Sign me up, Lord. I am down. Like, let's bring on the tension, the conflict. This could get me killed. Let's go. I am stoked, right? I don't feel that way. And I imagine that many of you would also be hesitant. You'd have some questions. I need to check this out. I might need to sit with this idea for a little bit, Lord. Now, this is the thing. God doesn't communicate in burning bushes very much anymore. I don't know what's happening when y'all go out in the woods, but I think we still find opportunities all throughout our lives to stand on holy ground, though. We might call it by very different names, but God is working in everyone's life in many ways, and sometimes we even have the eyes to see it. Holiness isn't only about awe and wonder and reverence. It's also about closeness, about intimacy with the divine, about vulnerability. It's about being home with God. And the things that make me feel like I'm on holy ground, that I'm on ground so holy I've got to take my shoes off, those are probably not the same things that make you feel that way. The thing that makes you feel so raw and seen and yet so comforted and held, that thing is probably not your neighbor's thing, right? I'll give you an example from my own life. I'm a little bit like Moses because I would probably find God out in the wilderness. I love to hike. I love to be outside. I absolutely adore it. Hiking is a spiritual practice for me. It's the best therapy in the world. I love it. The longer I can be out, the better. Days, weeks, months, I love it. Don't give me a shower. Don't give me a place to sleep. I'm in the woods. I'm in the dirt. I'm loving it. I love it so much. I wake up early in the morning and I do it in the summertime in Florida. I'm crazy. It's not normal, okay? And one of the reasons that I do that is because God's presence became real to me in a tangible way through the beauty of creation. That was the first place I found God. And then the more I got into spending time outside, the more I was finding God in all these places. I started to discover when I was hiking that I would find God just on every mountaintop waiting for me. I found God to be my constant companion on long hikes more than anywhere else in my life. Just to walk and talk with God away from all the noise of life, that's where I really connect. And I know that sounds nice and everything, but I bet you 70% of the room thought, that sounds horrible. I don't ever want to do that. The only way that I am going to connect with God on a mountaintop is if I drove there. That's not going to happen for me. That sounds hot and sweaty and buggy and awful and pointless. And it is. It is absolutely all of those things, and I love it. But it doesn't have to be your thing. That's okay, because you probably have your thing, right? We all have our place. So for some of you, that might be right here in this room, right? In a traditional worship experience, in singing in the choir, in the praise band, maybe something like that is your thing. Maybe it's being with your small group, right? Maybe for me, this looks a little bit more like rocking out to my praise music in the car. I'm not one who can perform and be in a holy space at the same time. Like I can't imagine singing and doing all the things that Kim does. But man, that's where she and so many others get fed, right? Is in that music experience, in praise and worship. It might not be in a church though, right? So for many of you, holy ground might have been found in a different place. So it might be out in the garden. It might be in an AA meeting. It might be walking on the beach. And in each of these places, there are ample opportunities to see that the divine is up to something, right? But everyone is inclined to see it differently and to pick it up in different places. I've spent a lot of time in the fresh expressions world, so I've seen people experience the presence of God in a lot of different places and ways, in tattoo parlors and on paddle boards and coffee shops and bars, and some people are flat out not going to experience God in those places. That's just not going to work for them, and that's okay. In preparation for this, I worked through the text with my students, and I asked them, what have been your holy ground moments in your life? What have been your take off your shoes moments? And they said all these beautiful but totally different things. For one guy, his spiritual moments are always when he's playing guitar. That's where he really connects. For another, it was the first time he saw the red-tailed hawk that lives in our yard at Wesley House. He said, I just watched it fly for a couple minutes and the world just stood still. It was the most amazing thing. One said it was when she discovered that poetry was an outlet that she needed to use to express herself, and that a lot of her poems were about her relationship with God. One guy said, I experienced the presence of God, the most significant moment in my life was at the first family reunion after my dad died, right? And then one said, it was when I finally got help and I found out that I could do something about my mental health. That was it. It was like, wow, that's maybe what it feels like being saved, right? things become real for us in different ways. God speaks to us, conveys a message to us in so many different ways. And their experiences were all completely different, but they all talked about intense emotions like feelings of relief or clarity or centeredness. Holiness looks different to everyone. That's the gift of our story today, but it's also one of the greatest lessons of campus ministry. I get to reflect on the sacred with young people at this critical time in life to grow and change and question things. And I'm constantly surprised by the power of their testimony, even if it looks really different from the expectations I had for them. Look at how many ways our students had deep spiritual experiences. I think when we come to accept and respect other people's spiritual journey, those differences are not only okay, we realize it's actually miraculous how many different ways God is showing up in our lives. But it's not always so easy to let those differences go. Sometimes we get so excited about our journey with God that we want everyone else to have that experience too. Not realizing, right, that they can't just take on our experience, right? Everyone is, folks can be a little my way or the highway, right, about their relationship with God. They want you to have their relationship with God the way they had it, the way they got there. They found home, and the easiest thing they can do for you is draw you a map, right? This is how I got home, and this should work for you too, right? But it doesn't always work like that. You run into people that maybe believe that you got to have this or that doctrine, or particular spiritual gifts, or maybe your gifts are not as valid or important. Maybe you run into folks who say you got to pray this exact prayer, this exact way to be right with God, right? So there's ways that we critique each other's spiritual journey, right? Anybody got family that maybe there's some religious tension when we get together? My family, I'll just tell you. People take different paths, and finding one's spiritual home can be a long road. Some of us just needed to move right next door to the spiritual home our parents had, and that one worked really well for us. But some folks, it's a restless, wandering, wayward road. They got to inspect all the options before they're going to find the spiritual home that calls to them. I'm a little more inclined that direction myself. And that can be really hard when you love someone and you're watching them take a radically different path than the one that got you home, right? That can be really challenging. The good news, though, is that we're Methodists, so we have tools for this. And in Wesleyan circles, we believe that grace doesn't wait on us, that God is working in every person's life, whether they're aware of it or not, that through prevenient grace, the grace that literally goes before, God is calling us toward goodness, toward love, toward faith and sanctification. Now, that doesn't mean we're off the hook. Everyone is on their own journey, but that doesn't mean we can't walk together. I used the word testimonies earlier. I was talking about my students' testimonies, which is funny because if they heard me say that word, they would probably go, ew, don't say that. Testimony is a word that has made me squirm at times. I grew up deep in the Bible Belt, but unchurched. There's a little story there. It's an uncomfortable word. It's not a word we use very often, but it's a word I think we ought to reclaim. Speaking to your personal experience, not somebody else's, mine. This is what I've been through. This is how I've seen God in my life. That kind of testimony. When we witness God's grace in our lives, when we experience a take off your shoes moment, when we get close to God's presence, we ought to tell people about it. Respectfully, naturally, in the course of a genuine relationship, right? Not so that they might have our experience of God, but so that it might inspire and inform them and empower them to seek their own experience of God. That's the first thing Moses gets ready to do. He's going to share his testimony. You can start to tell by the end of the story. He's going to go to the people and tell them what he's heard from God. But even Moses wants to convince people that his experience is valid, that he's telling the truth. He doesn't know if the Israelites will trust his encounter with God. Maybe that's not what holiness looks like to them. He's got to go back and explain this whole burning bush thing, It's a little tense. So he needs something convincing. And so he asks for specifics. And he says, I'm going to need to tell them exactly who this God is that's going to lead them out of Egypt. Give me your name. And God says, tell them I am who I am. Dennis Olson of Princeton Seminary says, perhaps a better translation of this text is, I will be who I will be in the Hebrew. I am who I am. I will be who I will be. There's so much possibility to unpack in this mysterious phrase. It's been endlessly debated by Jewish and Christian scholars for a millennia. But perhaps in light of our lesson in this text, that holiness looks different to everyone, perhaps God is trying to say to Moses and to us, I am bigger than the box you are trying to put me in. I am bigger than your understanding. And I am going to show up in more ways than you can imagine or put language to. I'm going to show up in each and every life in different ways, just like the one in a zillion person I created them to be. I am who I am. I will be who I will be, and you can't rein me in.